Hello and welcome to another conversation, Migration and Displacement with Caroline Joke. It's a very challenging time that we are all facing around the world. This has been with us for different durations in different parts of the world. And I'm talking, of course, about the Covid-19 pandemic that has really impacted on society as it functions. And impacted on migration as well. When these pandemic initially began, the initial reaction, unfortunately, was fear of foreigners. It was seen to be a disease from a certain part of the world, and we find that people from that part of the world where this began, were met with a lot of discrimination, as it were. They were targeted in attacks, and without really realizing that this is something that was going to face the entire world. And we've seen an evolution, of course, over time as these are spread almost everywhere in the world, and that's what I would like to dedicate this session on. So it's essentially the impact of COVID-19 on migration and displacement, as it were. And the first thing I would like to speak about is how COVID-19 has impacted on access to asylum. Borders in many parts of the world remain closed, different forms of closure. In my own country, Kenya, international travel has been suspended, for instance, so people really cannot come in. We have foreign nationals departing from the country. But the reality is that those who have to flee home for different reasons that make people get asylum, it doesn't mean that those reasons have ceased because of the pandemic. We have conflict continuing, even if not full-blown, but it's still in a way that it could impact on whether someone feels safe or not, or whether a family feels safe or not. We have other forms of reasons that make people flee, including natural disasters, floods. It doesn't mean that those reasons have necessarily ceased with the pandemic. And so, of course, there is a challenge of borders being inaccessible. And then what happens if someone actually makes it to those borders? Are they let in? What are the protocols that are put in place? Because at the same time, there has to be a protection of the general public, but not really giving up protection of migrants. There are reports of migrants being stranded on different migration routes. News of closures of borders found many of them on the way across the Horn of Africa. There are many reports that cite the fact that migrants are stranded in countries like Djibouti, where traditionally people have passed through to cross to the Middle East, to Yemen, and on to Saudi Arabia. There are reports of others being recently a private fishing vessel, and this is in public media, was used to turn away a migrant boat off the shores of Malta, and also the conditions of migrants in Libya are known to all. But at the same time, there have been really some good practices that I hope many other countries would adopt. For instance, the Portuguese government actually declaring asylum seekers and migrants with different statuses to be included. No, not really before the inclusion, but the Portuguese government sort of gave a blanket allowance of stay for migrants and asylum seekers that are in the country. And this essentially really impacts positively on public health, because the minute that migrants are excluded, or asylum seekers, or whatever status people have right now does not, I want to say it doesn't really matter. If those are not protected with a disease like this that's easily passed on through contact, etc., then the entire general public cannot be safe. And so this is a time when no exclusion of whatever category of migrants or asylum seekers, refugees. No country can afford to do that right now. The assumption that migration is suspended because of the closure of borders is really a fallacy. As I've said, there are still people who are trying to move across borders, and at the same time, there are so many that have been, can I use the term caught up? They've been caught up in countries of destination, whether they have regular or irregular statuses. And oftentimes we know that migrants, labor migrants or migrant workers often find themselves in precarious living conditions, many of them living in crowded accommodation with limited access to water and other really necessary sanitation conditions that are really important for the fight against COVID. And as I previously said, ensuring that even in places where migrant workers are accommodated, the transport that they use, for instance, to get to their places of work, ensuring that those take into consideration the public health measures instituted by the different countries to ensure not just their protection, but the protection of the entire general public is very, very important at this time. And to add this, I'd like to mention that different organizations have provided really useful guidelines on how destination countries, transit countries can support migrants, asylum seekers during this time of the pandemic. And the same applies to countries of origin. There are those who are managing to return back home. They are returning back home when at a time of economic downturn. So essentially they are returning home to really no jobs, and this was abrupt, no one saw this coming. So how is it that they can be supported where they are able to return home? How can they be reintegrated? Especially where in some countries, those that are returning from abroad are quarantined for a long time and at a really high cost. So what measures are being put in place to ensure that those migrants, many of them who are suddenly losing income, can come back home and reintegrate within their families? But that also speaks to some of the measures that hopefully post-COVID we put in place to protect migrant workers. And for instance, having a mechanisms of, putting in place mechanisms that support them to save, so that when they come home, they can come back to an income and not really feel destitute. The inclusion of migrants and asylum seekers, refugees in national COVID-19 response plans is absolutely key. As I've said a couple of times now on this video, this is not the time to segregate, put tags on people. Migrants, asylum seekers, refugees should have the same opportunities for testing, the same, access to protection. And really, one thing that is proving quite a challenge around this time, when countries are struggling with financing, the economies are doing really badly. There's been a massive loss of jobs. The ILO in the recent COVID Monitor third edition gave a very gloomy forecast in regard to the number of jobs that are being lost, and many of these are really in the informal sector. The informal sector where often people do not have as much protection, So how is it that, bearing this in mind, the social protection measures, or broadly the policy responses that are being put in place for citizens of these countries can be extended to migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees? And what do I mean by this? When countries announce extension of social protection, for instance, for the most vulnerable, migrant workers have been making a living before. Suddenly, we have We have businesses closing in retail, other sectors of the economy, in textile and garment production, etc. And suddenly, migrants who are not, if I can say, necessarily economically vulnerable, find themselves absolutely vulnerable. So how do we see that social protection measures that aim at protecting people at this really precarious time can also be extended to migrant workers, asylum seekers and refugees who find themselves suddenly without opportunities of work, as this is really a measure that has been taken to protect the general public. And also, how is it that, I don't know if it's too early to speak about, post-COVID. How will those be integrated back into some of the work that they were engaged in? Is their employment assured? These are some of the things that already workers, employers, and governments could start looking at. In terms of remittances, and this will be the last bit I speak on, with the impact, and really unprecedented impact on economies around the world, there are different projections on the impact on remittances. It is already clear that the level of remittances is going to drop significantly. Migrant workers have found themselves in situations of lockdowns where businesses are closing, etc. And so they really, they have a responsibility for families and for themselves, and so it is normal that they will find themselves not being able to send money back home. And some of these resources are really the lifeline for families back home, and they support these families, large numbers around the world, in terms of purchase of food and medical care, which could not be more important at this time. And so the impact on that generally around the world is going to be felt, and only time will tell what the numbers would look like. But these are just some of the issues broadly that I've thought to throw out to the public. If we can have a conversation around it, we would, I don't know what the impact of COVID-19 on migration and displacement will be in the long term. Will we see a world where there's a lot of caution? It's still very early to tell, and as the situation evolves and more information becomes clear, countries start opening up again, I think we could have a bit of clarity on how that looks like. So I'd like to leave it at that. Obviously, I'm not a medical practitioner, and so I'm looking at these more from really the migration angle, and what is now a public health issue has an impact on migration, on displacement, and different aspects of work and other elements that impact on the different categories of people in mobility. I would also like to invite you to join in our Rift Valley Institute series of webinars that's going to kick off next week. Please check on their website. I will be moderating some of those sessions, and we'll be engaging in conversations around some of these issues that I've highlighted on this session. So please stay home if you can. There are so many who cannot, because that means it's the difference between having food on the table for their families or not. Keep yourself safe. I hope your families are as well, and I encourage us all to be strong during this time, and hopefully we'll emerge out of the pandemic better. Please also remember to hit the subscribe button and invite your friends to subscribe and go through our really interesting conversations. Thank you.